Hello, everyone, and welcome again to Lakeside. My name is Brian, and I serve here as the associate pastor. Well, about 8 years ago, I decided to try something new in my life. It was a pretty big change, actually. One that some might call a discipline, while others might call foolish. And while I don't believe that this decision was foolish by any means, I will admit that it's not always gone the way that I had hoped or wanted. And at times, I felt like this thing would be the end of me. And other times, this thing has been something that I've wanted nothing more in my life. And I didn't do it alone. My wife, Kelly, and I decided to jump in this together. And so there, the two of us were in this brightly lit room. And I had this mask on my face, and my hair was covered, and even my shoes were covered. And then there it was. This thing began as the room filled with the first breaths and the first cries of our first child. Our lives forever changed. Our lives forever changed. We're officially parents. Then I'll never forget that moment, my heart literally almost bursting in awe and my head just racing with a million thoughts, dreams about life together with this a bundle of joy. And well, at least right up until the doctor hands me a pair of scissors and asks if I can cut the umbilical cord, which completely freaked me out. This is not something we do every day. Well, anyways, the months go by, and I continue to be captivated by the wonder of this little baby. And although I'm still captivated by that wonder, back then, well, little did I know the other side of this thing called being a parent, which was how dang challenging it was going to be. All right, well, we're in the midst of a new series about family relationships, and more specifically, why these most closest and intimate relationships can often feel so difficult. And last week, Pastor Adam got us started with a talk about marriage, the relationship between spouses, and why it's so important to work hard to stick with it. And tonight, as you can probably guess, we'll be talking about parenting, the relationship between parents and children, and why those relationships can so often be messy. And as a matter of fact, if I can risk sounding a little dramatic, at least in my experience, the parent-child relationship has proven to be one of the most challenging relationships that I've had to navigate. And given the conversations I've had with most of my other friends who also have kids, this isn't an uncommon feeling. And before I go any further, I know some of you may be thinking to yourselves, well, okay, but I'm not a parent. I'm not sure that this talk is really going to be relevant to me. Maybe you'd love to have kids, but for one reason or another, you just aren't able to. Or maybe you just really have no interest in having kids, and maybe you're not even sure if you like kids, right? Well, first of all, I get that. I think it's important to acknowledge these realities, and I want to be clear right up front, this talk, it's not a commentary about the merits of having children or not. It's not what it's about. But I would like to suggest that this talk about the relationship between parents and children is deeply relevant and important for each and every one of us for different reasons. Now, the first reason, and the most obvious reason, is that even if you don't have kids at this point in your life, there's a good chance that you might. A 2013 Gallup poll of over 5,000 men and women across the U.S. revealed that statistically, 95% of adults either already have or say they would like to have children at some point in their life, either biologically or through adoption. 95%. Wow. The second reason I suggest this talk is relevant to each of us is because whether or not you have kids of your own, we're all going to have some sort of interaction with kids in our lives, whether through relatives, through friends, maybe at work. Because the fact is, I'm sure you may have noticed, kids are everywhere, right? I mean, they're actually quite literally taking over the world day by day, right? And finally, a point of relevance that 100% of us have in common is that we all used to be kids ourselves. And we've all had relationships with a parent or a guardian of some sort. And now, this isn't an aspect that we're going to spend much time on in this particular talk, but I can't express how important it is, can't express enough how important it is to work at understanding the issues behind the difficult, if not downright dysfunctional relationships we may have experienced with our own parents or guardians growing up. And that's really so important because we've all been profoundly shaped by those experiences during our early formative years. And gaining awareness about ourselves and insight into those past experiences is just a crucial component of developing a mature and emotionally healthy self. Okay. Well, if I've convinced you that we all have a stake in this topic, one way or the other, then we can dive in. All right, sound good? Okay. Now, when we think of kids, all right, things that define their behavior, I'm sure all kinds of ideas come to mind. But there's three things that I think that we generally can completely agree on. And that's one, kids are pretty clear about what it is they want. Two, they're not always the most rational thinkers, right? And three, they do not hold back in letting you know when they don't get their way. And actually, come to think about it, that kind of sounds like adults often as well, right? Right, well, anyways, so I run across this blog that illustrates this point really well. Maybe you've seen it too. It's called Why My Kid Is Crying. So people send in funny pictures of their kids throwing fits over completely irrational things. And here are a few of my favorites. In this first one, this kid is crying because he can't find his rubber ducky, and yes, it's on top of his head. This next kid is all kinds of PO'd because her mother won't let her play with a bag of dog poop. Now this kid is raging because someone ate all of the muffins, although apparently he was the one who chowed them all down. And this last one I actually think is a pretty understandable reason to throw a fit. Her parents said she couldn't have more bacon. Yes, and by the way, I happen to know that Joe Lawrence, our worship leader, is also a big fan of bacon, and I'm pretty sure this is exactly what happens during breakfast at his house when his wife Jenny says, "No more bacon." All right. Well, okay, here's the thing. These examples are pretty funny, and they're extremely cute, but they're also just pictures. And the reality is that when kids throw tantrums like this, day in and day out, and especially over things that just seem nonsensical to us, it can be really draining. And honestly, it can be really frustrating. I think we've all probably been to the grocery store and heard the kid screaming from like 5 aisles down because he didn't get his Lucky Charms, right? And I was actually just at the store yesterday, and there's this little toddler sitting on the floor like 5 feet away from his mom, standing at the entrance, and he's just screaming and refusing to leave. And she just stood there with a cart full of groceries, absorbing stare after stare of people passing by. And I could see this mixture of frustration and exasperation and even a little bit of defeat on her face. And my heart went out to her because I've been there a time or two myself. Although I did eventually get up and leave. But see, these toddlers, they grow older and they get bigger. And often the frustrations and the irritations about our kids' behaviors and their choices can seem to grow just as quickly. And any parents will tell you in their moment of honesty that this is a two-way street, right? As parents, we can find ourselves yelling back at our children, throwing our own tantrums because that drink got spilled on the floor again, right? Criticizing too harshly, too often, exaggerating with words like, "You never pick up anything around the house," or "all you ever do is watch TV," perhaps even more hurtful words. And my guess is that all of us who are parents at one point or another have found ourselves feeling both exasperated by our children and regretful of our own reactions. Right, so what's going on? Why is this happening in what's supposed to be one of the most closest and most secure relationships that we'll ever have? Like, how do we go from those first moments of being wonder-struck, gazing into the eyes of our newborn, to days where we're feeling like this parenting gig is just simply too hard, it's too draining, and it's not what I signed up for? Whew. All right. Well, so here's the thing. I would love to just start bullet pointing the answers, right? But we all know that it just doesn't work that way. Every situation is different. Every adult, every child has their own unique personality, and the dynamics in these situations and relationships are just a complex thing. And although I wouldn't pretend to know the complexities or the definitive solution to anyone's challenging parent-child relationships, I will say that in my own experience as a parent searching for those answers, I found that again and again, a huge source of the problem is so often my own personal expectations. Expectations about how my child is going to behave, expectations about how I'm supposed to handle certain situations, expectations about how my child even understands the world in the first place, and expectations that I imagine others have of my children and have of me as a parent, and on and on. And so again, with acknowledging the complexities of this topic, I would suggest one of the most helpful starting places in understanding the difficulties in the child-parent relationships is to take a really close look at our expectations. And I think what we'll find is that all of us are holding on, to some degree, unrealistic expectations. And they set us up for disappointment. Right? And they can deeply exacerbate the relational challenges that we already face. So, for the rest of the talk, I'd like to take a look at a few ways that these expectations might get developed, how they affect us in our relationships with children, and finally, I'd like to propose what I believe to be a powerful remedy to these expectations. So when Kelly and I first found out that we were going to be parents, we did what most people who are expecting do, and we bought parenting books, we watched parenting videos, and we at least gave an ear to all the advice that was offered. Most of the stuff early on is how to keep your baby healthy and happy, and there are a lot of books, and you hear a lot of advice. And as it typically goes, as our son Noah got older, the books and the advice shifted from how to keep your baby healthy to how to discipline their behavior, understandably so. And there's certainly nothing wrong with parenting books and friendly advice. There's just a lot of it out there and a lot of strong opinions that go along with all that advice. But for all of the books on parenting that I read, or what I should say is books on parenting that my wife read and gave me the Cliff Notes on, just being honest, is that, it more than anything else, what made me realize that I was probably looking at the art of parenting just all wrong. Something that led me to that was actually the birth of our second child, our daughter Taylor. As a matter of fact, here's a picture of our little family. There might be a goofball in there somewhere. So Taylor, my daughter, has a completely different personality than our son Noah. Maybe this shouldn't have been so surprising to me, but just as Taylor has a completely unique personality, she responded completely differently to how Kelly and I parented. And so this actually was my big aha moment, where I realized that the perfect and singular parenting style was nothing but a myth. There is no one-size-fits-all approach. It just isn't there. And thinking or hoping that there is, it's just going to lead to frustration because it just simply doesn't work that way. And so what I've had to learn over the years, and of course I'm still right in the middle of this learning process, is that I so often make the mistake, and catch this, of trying to parent an expectation instead of engaging a true relationship with my children. And it's tricky because it's not always obvious, and it often develops out of good intentions. But in our pursuits to be the best parents that we can be, we often define and we label our children up and down with all kinds of expectations about how they're supposed to act, how they're supposed to understand the world, how they're supposed to respect us, how they're supposed to listen to our instructions. And the thing is all of those things are nothing more than just that, expectations. And the problem is that those expectations are generally not the truth about our children. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that we don't have hope and goals about helping our children develop, with kindness and intelligence, maturity, and all of that. Of course we do. But I wonder if then we can get things backwards. Instead of allowing ourselves to see our children right where they're at in any given stage of life, we instead start first with this expectation of what we think they're supposed to be. And when they don't measure up or fulfill those expectations, which they rarely will, they just rarely will, then we react against that. And then this funky little cycle begins to develop. We try our absolute hardest to raise our kids the right way, and when it's not turning out the way we expected, then we might wonder, what's wrong with my kid? Or perhaps we might wonder, what's wrong with me as a parent? And I think maybe amidst our stacks of how-to parenting books, we should also have a book titled something like Caution, Expectations Ahead. And these expectations, they don't just come from books or from Dr. Phil or from friends. A big part of them come from the way that we were parented directly, the culture of our childhood family systems, and the demands of society. And when we start adding all of that up, the unrealistic expectations that so often go into how we see ourselves and our children can potentially be a recipe for a relational disaster. And so one of the burdens that we put on our children, a mistake that I've just made countless times, is that we often hold our kids to standards that we don't even meet ourselves, right? We don't intend to do it, but I know for myself the problem is that I just simply fail to think it through, and I can be too quick to let those expectations kind of lead the way. As a matter of fact, I'm sure that my kids would be more than happy to compile a list of daddy fails. For example, hey, how many times have I asked you to hang your coat up when you come inside? The words rolling off my tongue just as I noticed my own coat draped over the back of the couch. See? Or here's one that might have been recent. Hey, you can't wear that shirt. You just wore that yesterday. The words rolling off my tongue as I look down and think, oh man, I wore this yesterday. Right? And while those examples may seem like not too big of a deal, we can't ignore the fact that this hypocrisy, at least from a kid's perspective, can be really frustrating to them. How do they see that? And then what about things like following through on commitments that we've made? Surely my kids are going to understand that my meeting went longer than expected. It's not like I wanted to miss the ball game. Or surely my kids will understand that I just had a rough day. I mean, they have rough days too. And I just don't have the energy to go out and build a snowman. But could it be what seems like reasonable expectations to us, in the eyes of that child, it can communicate something to them in ways that maybe they're less important than our work. And a lot of times, it's just absolutely true that you couldn't get away from work in time. Or it's absolutely true that you have nothing left in the tank. And honestly, if you went outside, you'd be the worst snowman builder ever, right? And in those situations, and they happen all the time to varying degrees, maybe we find ourselves getting frustrated that our kids are having unreasonable expectations of us, right? And then unintentionally, the words that come from our mouths can be a bit harsh in response. And we all know that these our examples are just the tip of the iceberg. There's a million scenarios, and I'm sure each of us could recount 20 of our own, just maybe from my week alone. I don't mean to discount how distressing and troubling some of these situations can get between parents and children. And I know because I've been through my own share of them, both as a child and as a parent. But for what it's worth, just at least one step today, if just nothing else, one step today in trying to get a handle on why this stuff happens, I think it'll do us well to work hard at thinking through how these many unrealistic expectations of our children and of ourselves are shaping our relationships with our children. It's helpful to reflect on the way that these expectations often set our kids up for failure and disappointment, and how all of these things circle back and exacerbate the problem. And so how do we work at that? Especially if expectations are so ingrained in us that we often act on them without realizing, which is what so often happens. How do we counter that? So again, I've got to first recognize that I get it, this is not a simple issue, but I want to draw our attention to something that Jesus said and what's generally referred to as a Sermon on the Mount. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus sits down with his disciples and a crowd of people following him, and he begins to teach. And after speaking about all kinds of things, from forgiveness to adultery to not judging others, towards the end of the speech, Jesus says, you should treat people in the same way that you want people to treat you. And we recognize these words, right? It's the golden rule. And I don't know about you, but I'm always so intrigued by the golden rule because it's one of the simplest but yet most profound instructions. But then Jesus goes on to conclude that the golden rule, with the words that we don't actually often hear, which is, and this is the law and the prophets. And this is no small thing because, in a sense, what Jesus is essentially doing by equating the golden rule to the law and the prophets, which is the reference to the Jewish scriptures, is he's illuminating the heart of morality. Treat people the way you want them to treat you. Of course. But I'm also intrigued at how hard that apparently is for me to follow. Maybe you've noticed about yourself as well. Simple, yet so challenging. So I had a defining experience and a lesson in parenting at one time where my eyes were open to something that I had just completely missed in the past. It was a particularly difficult day. Something else just to add to the clip of the daddy fail compilations. I'm feeling beyond frustrated, and I said something to one of my kids that was just mean. Now, I don't even remember, honestly, what I said, but what I won't ever forget, though, is my wife, Kelly, turning to me in that moment. And yeah, if you haven't already noticed, Kelly's the one who's usually having to correct me. It's a tiring job, I'm sure. Anyways, Kelly turns to me in that moment and basically just tells me the golden rule. Hey, don't say that to our kids. You don't want people talking to you like that. Good point. And the reason that was a defining moment for me as a parent, it wasn't that I didn't realize that it was wrong to say something mean to the kids, but because of that moment, I began to start thinking through the lens of the golden rule as the primary guide to how I should interact with my kids and how I should parent them. Maybe I'm just slow to learn, I don't know, but that was like this huge shift for me from trying to figure out how to parent my kid to maybe treat them the way that you would want to be treated if you were in their scenario or their context. In all the books on parenting and all the advice I'd heard, the golden rule just wasn't really something that I'd picked up on. Clearly, I'm not saying that I'm successful at always keeping the golden rule in mind when interacting with my kids, but it really has begun to shape how I approach them, how I see them, and it's been massively corrective in my propensities to project expectations on my kids. Now, here's just a few ways in which I'm trying to be intentional and to get better about starting with the golden rule when I interact with the kids. I often work from home, and so when my kids get off the school bus, I'm generally still working on a project or an email, something that's requiring my attention. And so a lot of times, the first thing that I'll want to say to the kids when they walk in the door is, hang on a second, I'm in the middle of something, I'll be done in just a second. And that's okay. Sometimes I do need them to hang on for a second so I can finish up. But a lot of times, what I'm working on, it can wait. And so on a good day, I try and think to myself, well, what's the first thing I'd want to hear from my dad when I walked in from a long day at school? And it's not, hang on a second, I'm busy right now. Okay, so I close my email when I can, and I go out to meet them on the sidewalk, or maybe when they get off the bus. And you know what? It feels really, really good. And I think it makes them feel really, really good. And it definitely feels a lot better than finishing up that email that can just simply wait for 15 minutes. Or when I'm having a rough day and the house is getting messy, and I feel like proclaiming that exaggeration, you guys never clean anything up around here, you just make a mess. I'll stop and think to myself, on a good day, right? How do I feel when someone out of the blue just dumps their grumpy on me, right? And I don't particularly like it. And if I have caused a problem, it'd be nice if they could at least approach me with a little bit of grace, right? Well, if I think through that grid, then maybe I can say, hey, it'd be really helpful if you guys could take a minute to pick up some things around the room. Another thing that I try to do is apologize when I've messed up. I let my kids know that I'm a work in progress as well. Daddy's got issues too. And when I've been rude or disrespected my kids in some way, I really just try and own up to that. And I find that to be really helpful and relationally healing when others have been rude to me. So maybe it'd be helpful in healing the relational hurts that I've caused between me and my kids. And there's just a million examples like this, right? I mean, every moment is an opportunity to think how we'd like to be treated before we act. Here's the thing. Is that a reasonable expectation of ourselves? Right? It's tricky. Because no, it's not a reasonable expectation that we always do this right. We're going to mess it up. And so we have to pay attention to how those expectations creep up on ourselves too. And finally, I'd like to leave you with one last thing to reflect on and think about in the coming days as it relates to relationships with kids. Whether they're your own kids, the kids of your friends, or maybe the child that will one day come into your life both as a blessing and as a challenge. If you've had this experience, go back in your mind to that first time that you met your child. Or think forward to that first time where you meet your child. And even if you never plan on being a parent, at least imagine in your mind when you first came into the world. Small, fragile, completely depending on others around you for everything. For food, for shelter, to be held, and to be loved completely. And you gotta know that these things remain in the hearts of our children. They're growing up in a world that they don't fully understand. Every day, when they get older, maybe even a little bit feisty, managing to make somehow an even bigger mess than when they were toddlers, our children are constantly asking these questions on the inside. Am I safe in this world? Am I good enough for you? Will you take your love away from me if I mess up? Or will you withhold your love from me if I'm not smart enough, fast enough, funny enough? Do I have to earn your love? Because I'm not sure I can or even know how. And while that may seem a little dramatic, well, I'm going to up the ante and suggest that there's nothing more true than that. I think we can sum all of those up in one question that I think every child is holding in their hearts. And if we could just see this question every time we look at the children, every time we interact with them, I think it would erase every expectation that leads us to treat our children with the greatest of care. And that question that they're asking and striving to understand, or as they're striving to understand this world, striving to understand you, as they're trying to understand themselves, is no matter what, will you love me unconditionally? And so, as God loves us completely, and Jesus challenged us to likewise love all people, especially the weak, the vulnerable, and the needy, all of which defines the heart of a child. The way we answer that question with our hands and with our words will define the relationship with our children. All right. Well, here at Lakeside, we have a number of families, and so there's usually kids running all around here. And whether it's out in the week as you go, but definitely around here, do me a favor. And when you see one of those little toddlers running by, one of the ways that you can show them that you're thinking about them, give them some attention, maybe even make them feel like they're the only ones in the room is, just get down on your knee, kind of get to their level a little bit, and just, ask them, anything. They don't even care. You pay attention to a kid like that, and it just lights them up, right? That would be something great that you could do. And the final thing I'll say is, when I said that this question of, will you love me unconditionally, remains in the heart of our children, we know who else that remains in the heart of: us. That's a question that we maybe we don't often think about it, but it's there. And Jesus was clear in saying that God loves us unconditionally, no matter what. He's not going to take his love away from us. We're not going to earn it because it's always there unconditionally. All right, let me pray with me.